Alright guys, so today we're going to be looking at a new type of variable. This variable is called an integer. Now I have a love-hate relationship with integers, and that's predominantly because they're both overused and underused. Now, what is an integer? An integer is a whole number. Now there are different types of whole number integers depending on what sort of whole number you're storing, but all integers are whole numbers. This is important because if you're going to do math on them and the result might not be a whole number, then you can't use an integer. Or if you need to store something that's not a whole number, so like 1.5, it can't be an integer. Now to demonstrate this, I have an application here called, oh well, I don't really have a name for it, but what it does is it divides whatever we put in here by 2 and then adds one number to the input box. So for example, 4 test integer. So 4 divided by 2 equals 2, and now we have 5 up here in the input box. So if we just click it, we actually get to see what happens if we divide a string of numbers by 2. So for our math brains, what do you think 5 divided by 2 is? Do you think it is 2? Give you a second to work it out. Yeah, la-di-da-di-da. The answer is no, it's not. It's actually 2.5. And we have this result because the integer, it can't store that extra little bit of information. It can't store that decimal point. So it doesn't. So it just drops it. Now, there are other types of number storage variables, and we will look at them. One of them is a double, so just for the example, we will look at doubles later. You can see that where an integer, when it divided 3, it would have said 1, whereas a double, 3 divided by 2, is 1.5, which is the correct answer. So I'd like you to keep that in mind whenever we're working with integers. They are a little bit of a trap if you ever are doing math. You can get some odd behavior from your program, but by using an integer when you probably should have used a variable. But let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is grab a group box, place it onto the screen just like we did last lesson. But this group box is going to be called ERP integer with the text integer. Now let's make that text a little bit better, shall we? Just knock that out of the way. Okay. Now, so just like last lesson, we're going to need 2 text boxes. One. Text box. 2. And a button. Now let's name these. So our first text box will be txt int for integer input. The second text box will be txt int, again for integer, output. Spell output right. And our button will be btn int run. Change the text to run or integer run. There we go. Now what I'd like you guys to do Let's just add one more item, just like we did with string. A label. This one won't be bold, our label won't be bold. Just a regular sized label. We'll call it LVL int. And we will put in a brief description of our integer, of what an integer is. So firstly, let's make sure that we've turned off auto size, so auto size false. If you remember from last lesson, this gives us the ability to appropriately size our labels. And then if we scooch down to there, we just want to give a brief description of what an integer is. So in C#, the variable type integer is designed to hold whole numbers. There are a number of different types of int There we go. We won't go into the types of integer just yet, but we will come back to that. Okay, so now that we've filled out that little box, what I'd like us to do is click the button and we'll take us to the code view. Now, we've now got two buttons with executed code on the one form. This is what we did last week here. This is what we'll be doing this week. So just like normal, in between the brackets, we're going to declare an integer. This can be done with the letters int, which stands for integer, and then just like a string, we give it a name. So we'll be calling it int input. There we go. Now, this is where things start to get a little bit different. Now, text boxes naturally hold text, but in code you can't just transfer of one variable type from another. So where it's in string, we're able to go directly from the text box .text into the input string. We're actually not going to be able to do that with an integer. So our line here will start off the same, so int input equals, and now it's going to get different. So firstly, we type in int, because what we want to create, we want to convert the text from our text box, import text box, into an integer. So the first thing we type is int dot parse. Now parsing is a type of, let's call it converting. So it will go through each letter, each character in the text field, and convert it into the equivalent integer number. So now we put in our text box, so txt dot int input dot text, and then we can finish off our line outside the brackets by adding our semicolon. So what that's doing is telling the computer that whatever is in this bracket needs to be converted into an integer. Now, if there's something in these brackets that can't be converted to an integer, so for instance, if you put letters into this input text box, it will actually crash the program. Now, we will touch on later how to prevent that, but it's just something to keep in mind. Because obviously letters can't be converted to an integer, so the parse will fail, at which point the program will crash. Now, we've passed this string here into an integer. So now we have this integer. Now let's do something to it. Let's times it by 2. Int input equals equals int input times by. Now, timesing in programming is actually a little star shape on the keyboard. If you just press Shift 8, you'll get that star. So we're going to times it by 2. Now, unlike a string, we don't put it inside bunny ears or apostrophes. So we leave it just as a 2 because the computer will automatically handle it as a number. So there we go. And now let's output it back to the screen. Now again, you can't convert an integer straight to a string, so we can't send this number straight back to the text box without converting it back to text. So we need to do something a little bit different here as well. So text string output, so our output text box dot text equals int input, which is our variable, dot to string. Now what that does is converts that variable back to a string. So let's test this. Let's click start, declaring variables, let's put in 2, integer run, and I got the wrong text box. That's embarrassing. Let's quickly fix that. So it highlights the importance of good naming people. There we go. Let's try that again. 2, integer run, and 4. There we go. So that covers declaring integers. I will add that for plussing and minusing and dividing integers, it's all very similar. So that's a plus, plus 2, or minus 2. It can be done just like that. Alright, so I will see you next lesson.